My mornings haven't changed in 40 years. The alarm buzzes at 5:30. I shut it off, swing my legs over the side of the bed, and slip into my work boots, the leather cracked, the soles worn thin from decades of concrete floors and ladders. May in Pennsylvania still holds a bite in the air. I pull on a faded work jacket and step into the garage. In the corner stands my red metal toolbox, the paint chipped, a little rust around the hinges. When I flip the lid open, the familiar smell of steel and oil hits me, and there it is, my oldest wrench. The grip is worn smooth where my fingers have lived for years. I pick it up and it feels less like a tool and more like an old friend. I never planned to be a plumber. At 18, plans didn't matter much. My father had died suddenly. My mom was left with 3 boys to raise, and college was out of the question. I needed work, and the local plumbing shop needed a pair of hands. That's all it took. Soon I was spending my days twisting pipe fittings, learning how to stop a flood before it ruined someone's home, how to sweat copper joints until they gleamed. By the time I met Linda, my wife, I had permanent grooves on my palms from pipe wrenches. She was a receptionist at an insurance office with a smile that made me forget I was covered in drywall dust. We got married 2 years later. Then Daniel was born. When I held him for the first time, swaddled in a hospital blanket, his tiny fingers curling around mine, I promised him, silently, that I'd give him the life I never had. No empty fridge, no winters without heat. I'd work myself to the bone if that's what it took. And I did. Some years were harder than others. Pipes don't care about holidays, so I took jobs on Christmas Eve, Thanksgiving morning, even once on Linda's birthday. I told myself it was temporary. When Daniel's older, I thought, he'll understand why Dad had to leave the table to fix a burst pipe at some restaurant across town. I thought wrong. The day before everything unraveled, I got the graduation announcement in the mail. The envelope was thick, the school crest embossed in gold. I set it on the kitchen table, smiling to myself. Linda saw it and grinned. "You'll wear a suit, right? First time in years I'll see you out of that uniform." "Yeah," I said. "I'll look decent. Don't want to embarrass the kid on his big day." Funny how words can boomerang back and cut you later. That night I was in the garage wiping down my tools when my phone buzzed. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I answered, happy to hear from him. "Hey, Dad," he started. His voice was careful, too careful. "So, I've been thinking about graduation, and I think it's better if you don't come." At first, I thought he was joking. "What?" I said. "I mean, it's just that my friends, my professors, and some people from the firm I'll be working at, they'll all be there. And, if they knew you were a plumber, it might make things awkward." I gripped the wrench so hard I could feel the cold steel bite into my skin. "You mean it might make you look bad?" I said. "No, it's not that," he hesitated. "It's just they wouldn't get it, and I've worked so hard to get here. I don't want anything to mess it up." "Anything," I repeated, "like your father." Silence. Then, "I've got to go, Dad." The line went dead. I stayed in that garage for a long time, the smell of oil heavy in the air. I kept replaying the call, each word hitting harder than the last. This was the boy I'd carried on my shoulders at county fairs, the kid I'd driven to baseball practice in my dented pickup, the young man whose tuition checks I'd mailed even when it meant putting off fixing our own roof. And now, I wasn't good enough to sit in the audience. The next morning, Linda noticed I was quieter than usual. "You okay?" she asked over breakfast. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." I didn't tell her I couldn't. I said something about the school limiting guest seats, that it would be better if we watched the live stream. She looked disappointed, but she didn't press. Graduation day came. I woke early as always, but instead of pulling on work boots, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, staring out the window. At 9 o'clock, I drove to a cafe near campus. I could hear the faint echoes of music from the stadium a few blocks away. I imagined Daniel in his cap and gown, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with professors. I imagined him looking out into the crowd, knowing his father wasn't there. When my phone buzzed, it was a photo Linda had found online, a group shot of Daniel with classmates. He had his arm around another student, both of them beaming. In the caption, "With my family." My chest tightened. I zoomed in. No me, not even Linda. Just him and people I'd never met. I closed the photo, set the phone down, and stared at my calloused hands on the table. These were the hands that paid for that gown, for that diploma. These were the hands that had fixed strangers' toilets at midnight so my son could graduate debt-free. But in that moment, they looked like nothing more than the reason I wasn't welcome. And that was the first crack in the wall between us. The day after Daniel's graduation, the house felt like it had swallowed its own sound. Linda had gone to the grocery store, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the dented corner of the refrigerator. I'd been meaning to fix it for years, but like so many things in my life, it had been pushed down the list, replaced by jobs that paid someone else's bills instead of tending to my own. It's strange, the way an empty house can sound louder than a noisy one. You hear the hum of the fridge, the faint tick of a wall clock, the groan of the wood as it settles. And underneath all of it, your own thoughts, circling like moths around a light bulb. I kept hearing Daniel's voice from that call. Not just the words, but the careful way he had shaped them, as if he were cushioning a blow. But there was no cushioning in the world soft enough to hide the sting. I thought about the early mornings when I'd driven him to school before my first job of the day, the smell of toast still clinging to his jacket. I thought about the nights I'd come home so exhausted I could barely lift my fork, but I'd still ask him about his day. I thought about the envelopes I'd slid across the bursar's desk at his university, knowing it was my sweat paying for those semesters. And I thought about how none of that had been enough to buy me a seat in the audience. When Linda came home, she had a paper bag tucked under her arm and a question in her eyes. "You didn't even watch the live stream," she said softly. I shrugged. Didn't feel like it. "Something happened," she pressed. I took a breath and considered telling her, but the words felt like gravel in my mouth. "Just tired," I said instead. She didn't believe me. She never did when I said that, but she let it go for the moment. 2 days later, I was back on a job, fixing a water heater in a cramped basement that smelled like mildew and mouse droppings. The owner, elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, kept offering me lemonade even though it was barely 50 degrees outside. I thanked her each time but kept working, crouched over the stubborn valve that wouldn't loosen. "Must be hard work," she said from the stairs. I smiled faintly. Been doing it so long I wouldn't know what else to call work. She tilted her head. "Your kids must be proud, a man who can fix just about anything." I hesitated. "You'd think so." The words slipped out before I could stop them. And for the first time in 2 days, I felt a tiny crack in the dam I'd built around this story. That evening after dinner, Linda was scrolling through her phone. "Have you seen this?" she asked, turning the screen toward me. It was a short video, a man in his 50s, sitting at a kitchen table, telling the story of how his daughter had once hidden him from her friends because he worked as a janitor. The comments section was filled with outrage on the man's behalf. Thousands of people offering support. "You should tell your story too," Linda said quietly. I laughed it off. No one wants to hear about some old plumber from Pennsylvania. But that night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about it. 3 days after the graduation, I found myself at O'Malley's, the kind of bar where the stools creak and the bartender knows your order before you speak. I was nursing a beer when a group of college kids came in, loud and laughing. They must have just finished finals, still in that glow of being free for the summer. One of them sat down near me and asked, "You work around here?" "Yeah," I said. "Plumber." He grinned. "Cool, my uncle's one, makes good money." It wasn't mockery, it was genuine. But I still felt that sting from Daniel's voice. Before I could stop myself, I said, "My son didn't want me at his graduation. Said my job would make people think less of him." The kid's smile faded. "Man, that's messed up." The girl sitting next to him leaned over. "You should put that on TikTok. I swear people would go crazy over a story like that." I shook my head. "I'm not really the TikTok type." "Doesn't matter," she said. "Just tell it like you told us. People need to hear it." On the walk home, their words wouldn't leave me alone. I kept picturing myself in front of my phone's camera, just saying it. No filters, no edits, just the truth. But another part of me wondered if telling it would make me patty or small. By the time I got home, Linda was already asleep. I stood in the garage for a long time, holding my oldest wrench. The steel was cold, grounding. I thought about all the times I'd held it to feed my family. And then I thought about how my own son had asked me to put it down. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. That night, for the first time in my life, I set the wrench down, picked up my phone, and hit record. I didn't think about views or likes. I didn't think about what Daniel might say if he saw it. I just thought about the truth and how sometimes that's all you've got left. I took a breath, looked into the lens, and said, "My name's Thomas Reed. I'm a plumber. And last week, my son told me not to come to his graduation because of that." I didn't sleep much that night. The video sat in my phone's camera roll, unsent, unseen by anyone but me. I kept replaying it, watching my own eyes as I spoke, the way they shifted slightly when I said "my son." There was no anger there, no performance, just a tired man telling the truth. At 3 in the morning, I finally uploaded it. No hashtags, no fancy caption, just, "For anyone who thinks hard work is something to be ashamed of." I put the phone down and went to bed. When I woke up, sunlight was filtering through the blinds. I poured coffee, sat at the table, and almost as an afterthought checked my phone. My jaw went slack. 12,000 views. By lunch it was over 100,000. Comments were pouring in faster than I could read them. "You're a hero in my book. Your son should be ashamed, not you. My dad was a mechanic. Best man I ever knew." Some were longer. People sharing stories of parents who'd worked hard, only to be looked down on by their own children. I felt an ache in my chest reading them, like I'd stumbled into a club I didn't know existed, one where membership cost the same kind of hurt. By evening, the number was climbing past 1 million views. My phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications, friend requests, interview offers from small podcasts I'd never heard of. Linda sat across from me at dinner, watching me with a mix of pride and concern. "This is going to get back to Daniel," she said gently. I nodded. "I know." The call came 2 days later. I was fixing a kitchen faucet for a young couple when my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. "Dad," Daniel's voice snapped through the line, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "What the hell are you doing?" I wiped my hands on a rag, telling the truth. "You made me look like a monster." "I didn't make you say those words, Daniel. You did." There was a pause, heavy enough to press into my chest. "You've ruined everything. People at work have seen it. My boss has seen it. Do you have any idea what that does to my career?" "Yes," I said quietly. "It does exactly what you were afraid of, only now it's not my job they're judging. It's yours." That night I didn't check my phone for hours. When I finally did, the video had crossed 3 million views. A local news station had picked it up. My face was in headlines like, "Plumber Dad Speaks Out After Being Asked Not to Attend Son's Graduation." The attention was overwhelming. Strangers stopped me in the hardware store to shake my hand. A man at the gas station told me I reminded him of his father, but it wasn't the praise that kept me up at night. It was the silence from Daniel after that phone call. 4 days later, Linda came into the garage holding her phone. "You need to see this," she said. It was a screenshot from Daniel's company's internal email. Effective immediately, Daniel Reed is no longer with the firm. I sat down hard on the workbench. The irony twisted in my gut. He'd pushed me away to protect his image, and now it was his own image that had cost him everything. Linda's voice was soft. "What are you going to do?" I stared at my hands. "I don't know, but I do know this: I'm not taking the video down." The next day, I recorded another one. Not about Daniel this time, about work, about pride, about how the value of a person has nothing to do with the polish of their shoes or the title on their business card. It didn't go as viral as the first one, but it found its audience. People left comments like, "Needed to hear this today," and "Reminds me of my mom." Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably watching all of it, hating me for it. But maybe, just maybe, he was listening too. That Sunday, I stood in the garage holding that old wrench again. My reflection winked back at me from the metal, a little warped, a little worn, but still there, kind of like me. I didn't hear from Daniel for over a week. In the silence, life went on in small, ordinary ways. Pipes still leaked, toilets still clogged. I still woke up at 5:30 every morning to lace my boots and start the day. The world doesn't pause for your family drama. It keeps dripping, breaking, rusting, whether your heart's in pieces or not. But the quiet between me and my son was a different kind of noise. Linda didn't push. She has a way of knowing when I'm holding something like a fragile piece of glass, poke at it, and it might shatter in my hands. She just made sure the coffee pot was full and dinner was on the table like she always did, and I think that was her way of saying I'm here when you're ready. One Wednesday afternoon, I was elbow deep in a kitchen sink replacing a rusted trap when my phone buzzed. Daniel. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Yeah, his voice was different, less sharp, less certain. I'm back in town. I waited. Can we talk? He asked. We met at Murphy's Diner, the kind of place where the booths are cracked vinyl and the waitresses call you Han. I picked it because it was neutral ground. No one to overhear except the regulars who were more interested in their pie than my family business. When Daniel walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair was a little longer, his shoulders slumped just enough to notice. The tailored suits he used to wear had been replaced by jeans and a wrinkled shirt. He slid into the booth across from me. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, he said, I lost the apartment, couldn't keep up with the rent after, he trailed off. After you lost the job, I finished for him. He nodded, eyes on the table. They said it wasn't just the video, but it didn't help. The waitress came, poured coffee for both of us. The smell rose between us, familiar and grounding. Why'd you call? I asked after she left. He swallowed hard. Because I think I understand now. Understand what? What you did all those years, working when you didn't have to, missing things. I used to think you just didn't care enough to be there, but you were there, just not in the way I wanted. I sat back, feeling something twist in my chest. I'd imagined this moment for years, my son finally seeing me, really seeing me, but in my imagination it didn't come on the heels of him losing everything. I never cared about looking impressive, I said quietly. I cared about keeping the lights on. I cared about making sure you didn't start your life already drowning in debt. I know, he said. Do you? I asked, leaning forward. Because the day you told me not to come to your graduation, that day, you told me I wasn't good enough to stand beside you. That's not about understanding or misunderstanding. That's about shame. He winced. I was wrong. I know that now, and I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. I wanted to let them in, to believe them completely, but something in me was still sore. Forgiveness is a muscle. It can't lift the heaviest weight right away. I nodded slowly. You've got to decide who you are, Daniel. Not just when life's going smooth, but when it's coming apart at the seams. The world's going to judge you for something no matter what. The only thing you get to choose is whether you're proud of the reason. We finished our coffee mostly in silence. When the check came, I reached for it, but Daniel put a hand over mine. Let me. It was a small thing, but after everything, it felt like the first brick being laid in a wall we might be able to build back together. Not the wall that had stood between us, but one that might keep the worst of the world out. That night back in the garage, I picked up my old wrench again. It was streaked with oil, heavy in my hands. For years, it had been my lifeline. Now somehow it felt like it might be Daniel's too, if not literally then as a reminder. I set it on the workbench. Someday I'd hand it to him, not because I wanted him to use it, but because I wanted him to remember. Remember what pride looks like when it's built, bolt by bolt, from the ground up. The next morning, Daniel showed up at the house. Linda had already set out 2 mugs of coffee before I even came down the stairs. She has that sixth sense for when someone's coming over, and even more for when it's family. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping the mug in his hands like it was a stress ball. I'm staying with a friend right now, he said when I sat down. But it's temporary. I need to figure out what's next. I sipped my coffee, letting him fill the space if he wanted to. I've been sending applications, he went on. But the interviews aren't coming. I think my name's poisoned right now. The video, I held up a hand. Don't blame the video told the truth. The problem is you don't control the way people see you once they've seen the truth. He looked down, nodding slightly. I guess I just don't know where to start. That afternoon, I was under a house replacing a busted section of pipe when my phone buzzed with a text from him. Do you think you could teach me? You know, plumbing stuff. I stared at it for a moment, water dripping somewhere near my ear. It wasn't the kind of message I'd ever expected from him. He'd spent years chasing the clean-cut corporate path, the exact opposite of what I did. Now he was asking for a wrench. I texted back, if you're serious, meet me tomorrow at 6 a.m. The next day he showed up in sneakers, jeans, and a t-shirt. No gloves, no boots. I tossed him a pair of work gloves and an old cap. Rule number 1, I told him as we loaded the truck, you're going to get dirty. Rule number 2, you don't complain about getting dirty. He smirked. Got it. We spent the morning fixing a leaking toilet in an apartment complex, then replacing a corroded valve in a laundromat. I watched him struggle with tools that felt like extensions of my own hands. His grip was awkward, his shoulders stiff. But he didn't quit. At lunch, sitting on the tailgate of the truck, he said, I always thought you just did this stuff without thinking, like it was automatic. It is after 40 years, but it took me a long time to get there. You don't learn this from a book. You learn it from crawling into places you'd rather not be, and figuring it out because someone's depending on you. We worked side by side for 2 weeks. He was quieter than I remembered, but in that quiet there was something different, not the old, dismissive silence, but a listening kind. One Friday, as we were packing up, he said, Dad, I've been thinking, I want to make a video. I raised an eyebrow. About plumbing. No, about you. About what I said and how wrong I was. The next day he came over with his phone and a tripod. We set it up in the garage, the old wrench on the workbench behind us. He hit record and began, My name's Daniel Reed. A few weeks ago I told my dad not to come to my graduation. I told him I was worried what people would think because he's a plumber, and I was wrong, so wrong. He talked for 5 minutes about the hours I'd worked, the bills I'd paid, the sacrifices he hadn't seen until now. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked more than once. When he finished, he looked at me. Should we post it? That's up to you, I said. By the next morning, the video had 1 million views. The comments poured in, calling it redemption, growth, a rare example of someone owning their mistakes. Some even recognized me from my own video, calling us the plumber dad and son. Daniel read them out loud at the table, shaking his head. I can't believe people care this much. They don't just care about you, I said. They care about what you're saying. They care because it's something they wish they could say to their own parents. A week later, a local TV station invited both of us for an interview. Daniel hesitated but eventually agreed. We sat under the bright studio lights, side by side, answering questions about forgiveness, pride, and family. When it was over, as we were walking back to the car, he said, You know, I don't think I'm ashamed of the wrench anymore. I smiled. Good, because one day, it's going to be yours. That night, I put the wrench back on the bench. I didn't know exactly when that one day would be, but for the first time in a long time, I knew it would come. It's funny how quickly routines change. A month ago, Daniel wouldn't have been caught dead in the passenger seat of my work truck. Now every morning there he was, gloves stuffed in his back pocket, coffee in hand, still learning which tools were which. He wasn't trying to become a plumber forever. I knew that, he knew that. But he was learning something more important than how to fit a joint or clear a drain. He was learning how to show up no matter the job. One Monday, we were on our way to a small job, replacing a leaky faucet for an older couple when Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then at me. It's a recruiter, he said. I nodded toward it. Answer it. He did, and for the next 10 minutes I listened to his polite, professional voice explain where he'd been working recently and why he'd left. He didn't mention the viral video. I wondered if he would if they asked. When the call ended, he exhaled. They want me to come in Wednesday. That's good, I said. Yeah, he replied, but his eyes were far away, already somewhere in that office, already in the suit he hadn't worn in weeks. Wednesday came. Daniel showed up at my house early in a suit that had been sitting in his closet since his last corporate job. "You nervous?" I asked. He straightened his tie. "A little. What if they saw the videos?" "Then you tell them the truth," I said. "The truth's what got you into this mess. And the truth's the only thing that's going to get you out of it." That afternoon, he called me from the parking lot. "It went okay, I think, but they did bring it up." And I told them everything. I thought they'd write me off right there, but the hiring manager said it was refreshing. Said most people try to hide their mistakes. She respected that I own mine. I could hear a small smile in his voice, the kind you don't realize you're wearing until someone points it out. By the end of the week, they offered him the job, entry level, not glamorous, but a start. We celebrated with takeout Chinese at my kitchen table. Linda poured us each a beer and Daniel raised his bottle. "To starting over," he said. "To starting right," I corrected, and we clinked bottles. For the next month he worked his new job during the week and still rode along with me on Saturdays. "Keeps me grounded," he said. I didn't argue. One Saturday we got a call from a single mother whose basement sump pump had failed. Water was pooling fast and she sounded panicked. When we arrived, Daniel was the first one down the steps, kneeling in the water without hesitation to help me get the pump running. When we finished, she handed him the check instead of me. "You did good, young man," she said. I watched the way Daniel's shoulders lifted, not in pride about the money, but in the satisfaction of being trusted to handle something important. A week later, it happened, the first real test. Daniel had been invited to a networking mixer through his new job. "It's all suits and handshakes," he said. "Not exactly your thing." "Maybe not," I said, "but if you want me there, I'll go." He hesitated. "You sure you'd be comfortable?" I gave him a look. "You comfortable with me being there?" He took a deep breath. "Yeah, I think I am." We walked into the hotel ballroom together, him in his suit, me in my best collared shirt and pressed slacks. Conversations paused as people noticed us, and I could feel that old, familiar question in the air. Who's the guy with the rough hands? Daniel didn't flinch. He introduced me every time as my dad. "Thomas, best plumber in Pennsylvania." Not just my dad, not just a plumber, both side by side. And in that moment, I knew we'd passed something bigger than a test. We'd crossed back into each other's lives for good. That night back in the garage, I picked up the old wrench and turned it over in my hands. The steel caught the light, just enough to reflect both our faces in its curve. Mine lined with years, his still young but learning. I didn't know where his road would take him next. But I knew one thing. Wherever it went, he wouldn't be ashamed of the road I'd walked to get him there. You never really know when the past will walk into the present uninvited. For me, it happened on a Thursday evening, 2 months after Daniel had started his new job. He'd settled into a rhythm, Monday to Friday in an office, Saturdays riding shotgun in my truck. We didn't talk about the graduation anymore, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been folded into the fabric of our days. That Thursday, his company was hosting a charity fundraiser at a downtown hotel. Daniel asked me to come along, not as his plus one, but as a volunteer. "We need extra hands at the silent auction tables," he'd said. I agreed. I figured I could manage a suit and tie for a few hours, especially if it was for something good. The ballroom was all polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and the low hum of polite laughter. I stationed myself at one of the tables, checking off bid sheets, answering questions about the prizes. Halfway through the night, I noticed a small group of men near the bar, talking with Daniel. They were well-dressed, drinks in hand, the kind of posture that says, "I know exactly how expensive this jacket is." I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw one of them glance toward me, smirk, and say something that made the others laugh. Daniel's smile faltered. He said something back, short, sharp enough that the man's smirk froze. Then Daniel excused himself and walked straight toward me. "You okay?" I asked as he reached the table. "Fine," he said, but there was a heat under the word. "What happened?" He shook his head. "One of them recognized you from the video, thought it was funny, made a joke about how my family brand is a wrench and a bucket of water." I waited, letting him decide how much to share. "I told him," Daniel went on, "that my dad's work built my entire life, that I'd rather have a wrench for a family crest than a pile of unpaid debts." I felt something shift in my chest, not pride exactly, but something deeper, something steadier. Later that night, when the auction ended, Daniel and I carried a few boxes out to the truck. On the way he said, "You know, 6 months ago I probably would have laughed along with them, just to fit in. And now," he looked at me, "now I think I'd rather be left out than laugh at the wrong thing." The next morning my phone buzzed with a text from one of Daniel's co-workers. "Your son shut down a guy last night who was being a real jerk. Just thought you should know, made the rest of us proud." I read it twice before setting the phone down. For years I'd worried about what kind of man Daniel was becoming. That morning I stopped worrying quite so much. That weekend we were back in the truck, headed to a service call. Daniel glanced over at me and said, "I've been thinking about something." "Dangerous habit," I teased. He smiled faintly. "When I make enough, I want to buy you something, something you'd never get yourself." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But something that says, 'I see you, Dad, really see you.'" I didn't tell him he'd already given me that. I didn't tell him that hearing him defend me in that ballroom was worth more than anything money could buy. Some gifts you don't need to unwrap. That night, back in the garage, I set the old wrench on the bench and turned off the light. Its outline was barely visible in the dark, but I didn't need to see it to know it was there. Just like I didn't need to hear the words to know what my son felt now. For the first time in years, I believed this. He wasn't just my boy anymore. He was my ally. The first time my face ended up on the news, it was because of what my son said to me. The second time, it was because of what my son said for me. It started with a phone call from a local radio station. They wanted to interview the plumber dad and his son after someone had posted a clip from that charity night online. It showed Daniel shutting down the man who'd made the joke about me. The clip was only 20 seconds long, grainy, filmed from across the room, but it hit a nerve. By the time the radio station called, the video had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from strangers. "That's a man owning his mistakes. We need more sons like this." My dad worked in construction. I wish I'd said something like this before he passed. I agreed to the interview only because Daniel said yes first. I didn't want to drag him into another spotlight, but when he looked at me and said, "This one's different," I believed him. The station was downtown in one of those old brick buildings that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. We sat across from the host in a small studio, the walls padded in faded blue foam. "So, Thomas," the host began, "last year you went viral for telling your story about being a plumber and not being welcome at your son's graduation. Now, it seems like things have come full circle. What's changed?" I glanced at Daniel before answering. "We talked, we worked together, and I think we both realized there's more to being proud than just standing on a stage in a cap and gown or fixing pipes in a basement." The host turned to Daniel. "And what made you speak up for your dad that night at the fundraiser?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Because he deserved it. Because I realized that if I stayed quiet, I'd be agreeing with what they were saying. And I'm done agreeing with the wrong things." The interview ran for 15 minutes. We laughed a little, got serious a few times. When it was over, I figured it might get a few local listeners and fade away. I was wrong. By that evening, clips from the interview were everywhere: Facebook, TikTok, even the evening news. This time, the headline wasn't about shame or estrangement. It was about reconciliation. "Plumber dad and son go viral again for the right reasons." The attention felt different this time. People weren't just siding with me, they were rooting for us. Strangers stopped us in the grocery store to say, "Glad to see you two work things out." A high school teacher emailed me asking if I'd come speak to her students about work ethic and forgiveness. Even the mayor's office sent a note congratulating us on showing the community what family values look like. Linda kept shaking her head. "You two are practically celebrities now. Who would have thought?" I told her I didn't care about celebrity, but I couldn't deny the quiet warmth I felt every time someone told me they'd shown our story to their kids. Of course, not everyone was on board. One afternoon, while Daniel and I were grabbing lunch at a sandwich shop, a man at the next table leaned over. "So, you're the famous plumber, huh? The one whose kid kicked him out of his own graduation." Daniel stiffened, but the man went on, smirking. Bet you're loving all this attention now. Must be nice to get famous for being humiliated. I opened my mouth, but Daniel got there first. You know what's nice, he said calmly. Knowing the man you're sitting across from has nothing to hide, that he worked for everything he's got, and that I'm proud to call him my dad, that's what's nice. The man didn't have much to say after that. A week later, we got an email from a national morning show. They wanted us to fly to New York for an in-studio segment. It's a feel-good story, the producer wrote. America needs those right now. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. TV lights, big audiences, none of that was my world. But Daniel said, Dad, this time we get to write the ending together. So we went. The studio was colder than I expected, bright and buzzing with people wearing headsets. The host greeted us with that polished TV smile, but when the cameras rolled, she leaned in like we were just two neighbors chatting over coffee. She asked about the first video, about the fallout, about working together, about the fundraiser moment. And then she asked the question I hadn't expected. What do you hope people take away from your story? I thought for a moment before answering. That a person's worth isn't in the title on their business card. It's in the way they show up, day after day, year after year, for the people they love. When the segment ended, the host shook my hand and said, You're going to make a lot of dads proud today. On the flight home, Daniel looked out the window for a long time. Finally, he said, You know, if you hadn't posted that first video, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have fixed anything. I smiled. Sometimes you have to break something open before you can fix it. He nodded slowly, still looking at the clouds. Guess I'm glad you did. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I believed we were both truly on the same side. Not just for the cameras, but for life. The thing about public reconciliation is that it can make you believe the private work is done. It's not. After the TV segment, life went on. Work orders came in. Bills needed paying, groceries needed buying. Daniel's job kept him busy during the week, but he still joined me on Saturdays for plumbing calls. We'd gotten used to the rhythm of it, the unspoken ease of being in the same truck without having to fill every silence. But real relationships aren't built in the spotlight. They're tested in the dark, in the small, messy corners no one sees. It started with a call from Mrs. Holt, a long-time customer of mine. Her husband had passed 2 years earlier, and I'd been the one to keep her old farmhouse in working order ever since. She sounded flustered on the phone. The upstairs bathroom's leaking into the kitchen ceiling. Can you come today? I told her we'd be there in an hour. Daniel met me at the house, still in his work clothes from the week, dress shirt, slacks, and polished shoes. I handed him an extra pair of work pants and boots from the truck. We climbed the stairs, and I could hear the faint, steady drip before we even reached the bathroom. Daniel wrinkled his nose at the smell of damp wood and mildew. Welcome to the glamorous side of plumbing, I said. The leak was in the supply line under the tub. Fixing it meant shutting off the water, cutting into the wall and crawling into a crawl space that even I hated. I explained what we needed to do, expecting him to jump in. Instead, he hesitated. You sure we can't just call someone else for this part? This isn't exactly my area. I looked at him. You want the job when it's clean and easy, but not when it's dirty. It's not that, he said quickly. It's just, I don't know if I'm good at this part. We went back and forth for a few minutes, my patience wearing thin. Finally, I said, Daniel, this is the part that matters. Anyone can tighten a bolt. Not everyone sticks around when the job gets ugly. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. We spent the next 2 hours in that crawl space, me holding the flashlight, him working the wrench in a cramped position that left his shoulders aching. By the time we finished, his shirt was streaked with dust, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Mrs. Holt insisted on paying extra, but I waved her off. You've got enough to manage. On the way back to the truck, Daniel didn't say much. I thought maybe he was tired, but when we stopped for coffee, he finally spoke. You were right, he said, about sticking around when it's ugly. I think that's what I was bad at before, not just with work, he glanced at me. With you. We sat there in the coffee shop for a long time, talking in a way we hadn't before, Not about the past, but about the present. About what it meant to actually show up for people, even when you'd rather look away. I told him something I'd never said out loud. I wasn't just hurt when you told me not to come to your graduation. I was scared. Scared I'd failed at the one job that mattered most, being your dad. His eyes were steady on mine. You didn't fail. I just didn't see it until it was almost too late. That night, back in the garage, I put my tools away and sat on the workbench for a while. There was no applause, no cameras, no viral clip. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing we'd done a hard job together and come out cleaner on the inside, even if the outside was a mess. Some repairs don't make the news, but they hold the house together all the same. Some lessons you learn in the quiet, others come with water rushing at your feet. It was a Thursday afternoon when the call came from the Franklin Community Center. I'd done odd jobs for them over the years, replacing faucets, clearing drains, but this was different. "We've got a pipe burst in the basement," the director said, panic bleeding through her voice. "The whole place is flooding." I was already grabbing my keys when Daniel walked into the garage. "Ride along?" I asked. "Sure," he said. "How bad?" "Bad enough they called me instead of the city." When we got there, water was spilling out the basement door in a steady stream. The air smelled like rust and panic. Volunteers were carrying boxes of donated clothes and food upstairs, their shoes sloshing through an inch of standing water. The director, a small woman with wiry hair, waved us down. "Main water shutoff's down there, but it's under about 2 feet now. I don't know what else to do." Daniel and I exchanged a look. This wasn't a Saturday side job. This was an emergency. We waded into the basement, the cold water biting at my calves. The main shutoff was in the far corner, behind a row of heavy shelves stacked with cleaning supplies. Moving them would take 2 people minimum. "On 3, I said. We lifted, strained, and shuffled the shelf far enough to squeeze behind it. Daniel crouched down, feeling along the wall until his hand found the valve. "Got it," he shouted, twisting hard until the wheel groaned and the water slowed, then stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was our breathing and the faint drip of what was left. But the real work had just started. The burst section of pipe was behind a panel, and the water had already soaked through boxes stacked against it. We had to move fast. Daniel worked beside me, pulling boxes out of the way and stacking them on higher shelves. Every so often, I'd catch him looking at me, waiting for the next instruction, like he trusted I knew exactly what to do. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of that trust as something I could carry without resentment. We cut out the bad section, replaced it with copper, and sealed the joints. By the time the last fitting cooled, the floor was littered with wet cardboard, but the water was gone. The director came down, her eyes wide. "You just saved us thousands," she said. "We'd have lost half the donations down here." She tried to hand me a check. I shook my head, put it toward the next food drive. Daniel added, "Yeah, consider it paid in full." We walked out into the late afternoon sun, both of us dripping from the knees down. My back ached, my hands were stiff, but there was a lightness in me. In the truck, Daniel leaned back in the seat, wet hair sticking to his forehead. "You know, if this had happened a year ago, I probably wouldn't have been here, wouldn't have even known you were doing it." I glanced at him. "And now?" He looked out the window, thinking. "Now I can't imagine not being here. That night Linda met us at the door with towels. 'You both smell like a fish tank,' she said, wrinkling her nose. But she was smiling as she said it. Later, as I put my tools away in the garage, I rested my hand on the old wrench again. The metal was cool under my palm, grounding me. That day hadn't been about the pipe, or the water, or even the donations we'd saved. It had been about knowing that when the pressure was on, my son and I could stand knee-deep in the mess together and not run. Some floods you can't stop, but if you're lucky, you find someone who will wade through them with you. Life has a way of circling back, handing you the same test in a different form just to see if you've really learned the lesson. For me, that test came on a bitterly cold Saturday in January. The kind where the wind slices through your coat and the air smells faintly of snow. I just finished my second job of the morning when Linda called. Thomas, I don't like the sound of you right now. You're wheezing. I'm fine, I said, even though my chest felt tight. I'd been fighting off a cold all week, but I wasn't about to cancel the last job on my list. Before I could argue, Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, wearing work gloves and a determined look. "Go inside, Dad," he said. "I've got this one." The job was across town. A heater line in a small apartment building had frozen, leaving 3 units without heat. Normally, I'd handle it without thinking, but I could feel the fever in my bones. "You don't know the layout," I said. "Then you'll tell me what to do step by step." It was strange, sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket over my shoulders, giving instructions over the phone while Daniel crawled under floors and wrestled with frozen pipes. I could hear the strain in his breathing, the clatter of tools on concrete. At one point, there was a long silence. "You still there?" I asked. "Yeah," he panted. "Just stuck on this last joint. It's rusted solid. Heat it with the torch. Slow, even passes," I said. "Don't rush it, let the metal loosen on its own." 5 minutes later, I heard the faintest laugh through the line. "Got it." 2 hours after he'd started, Daniel called again. "Heat's back on," he said simply. I felt something loosen in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. That evening he came by with takeout, my favorite chicken pot pie from the diner. "Figured you could use a break from cooking," he said, setting it on the table. Over dinner I told him, "You did good today, better than I could have done in my condition." He shrugged. "You've been doing that for me my whole life. Figured it was my turn." After he left, I went into the garage, pulled the old wrench off its hook and just held it for a while. For years, it had been the symbol of what I carried alone. Now I realized I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. And maybe that was the whole point. If you told me a year ago that my son and I would be sitting at the same table, laughing about plumbing jobs and TV interviews, I would have told you you'd been breathing in too much solder smoke. But here we were. It was a quiet Sunday morning in March. Daniel had stopped by for coffee before heading to his own job. Linda was at the sink, humming while she rinsed the breakfast dishes. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, lighting the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Daniel leaned back in his chair, cradling his mug. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I used to think being proud meant looking like you had everything together. Nice suits, shiny shoes, big titles. But now I think it's just about being able to look someone in the eye and not feel like you have to hide anything." I smiled. "Took you long enough." After he left, I found myself walking into the garage without thinking. The wrench hung on its usual hook, the steel dulled by years of work. I took it down and turned it in my hands. For decades, it had been just a tool. A way to keep the lights on, the fridge full, the rent paid. Then for a while, it became a weight, something my son saw as a symbol of embarrassment. And now it was something else entirely. A reminder of every leak fixed, every winter heated, every lesson that didn't come from a classroom. That afternoon, Daniel called. "Dad, got a minute?" "Always," I said. "I've been thinking, you remember that apartment job I did when you were sick? Well, one of the tenants told me she'd been turned down for a repair before because she couldn't pay upfront. I didn't tell you, but I fixed something else while I was there. Didn't charge her." I could hear the smile in his voice. "I guess I just wanted you to know," he said. "I get it now. Why you always did the extra stuff no one paid you for." For a moment, I didn't say anything. My throat was tight in the same way it had been the first time I held him as a newborn, full of something too big to name. "I'm proud of you," I said finally. "More than you know." In the weeks that followed, we didn't talk about the old wound much. We didn't need to. The work we were doing together, whether fixing pipes or showing up for each other, was the conversation. We still got recognized sometimes. In the grocery store, at the gas station, people would stop us to say they'd seen our videos. They'd tell us about their own fathers, their own sons, the bridges they wished they could build back. And every time I'd think, if telling our story gave someone else the courage to pick up the phone, to knock on a door, to say, "I was wrong," or "I forgive you," then all the noise, all the spotlight was worth it. One evening, as spring began to push winter out the door, Daniel came by after work. He walked into the garage, looked at the wrench hanging on the wall, and then at me. "You ready to give it to me yet?" he asked with a grin. I took it down and handed it to him. "It's yours," I said. "Not because I want you to use it, but because I want you to remember what it means. Every time you see it, I want you to think about what it took to keep this family standing." He turned it over in his hands, the same way I had 1,000 times. "I will," he said quietly. We stood there for a moment, the smell of oil and metal around us, the years between us folding into something solid and whole. And I thought, sometimes the proudest moments aren't the ones you get applause for. They're the ones that happen in a quiet garage, with nothing but the weight of a wrench passing from one hand to another. To everyone listening, watching, or reading this, thank you for being part of this journey with me and my son. Life isn't neat. It isn't polished. But it's worth every mess, every hard day, every moment that tests you, if you can come out the other side still holding the hands that matter. I wish you health and I wish you happiness with your family. May you never be ashamed of the work that puts food on the table or the hands that do it. And may you always have the courage to show up for others and for yourself.